The dust of Marrow Creek was a fine, red powder that coated everything, a shroud for the dying. It settled in the lines of a man's face, clung to the hem of a woman's dress, and gave the unforgiving sun a hazy, bloodshot eye. Elias Walker rode into it not with purpose, but with the slow, weary gait of a man who had run out of places to go. His horse, a sturdy buckskin mare, dropped her head against the oppressive heat, each step a reluctant effort on the cracked, thirsty earth. Marrow Creek was a town built on a lie. Its name promised life, a source of vitality drawn from the bone. The reality was a dry creek bed, a snake skeleton of bleached stones and splintered, ancient roots where water had not flowed for 2 seasons. The town itself was little more than a collection of sun-warped buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the relentless wind. The saloon, the general store, the sheriff's office, and the church. They all looked tired, their false fronts peeling, their wood groaning under the constant assault of the elements. Men watched him from the shade of the blacksmith's lean-to. Their eyes narrowed slits of suspicion. An outsider was a disruption, an unknown quantity in a town where every misery was already measured and accounted for. They were gaunt men with hardened hands and a bitterness that had taken root deeper than any crop could. Their land was parched, their cattle were thin, and their tempers were worn to a raw nerve. Elias felt their stares like a physical weight. He had felt such stares before in other towns, in other desolate corners of the world, and he knew they were a preamble to trouble. He wanted none of it. He wanted only a drink of water that was not gritty with sand, a bed that was not the hard ground, and a night's peace from the ghosts that rode with him. The wind was a constant companion here. It was not a gentle breeze, but a hot, scouring force that picked up the red dust and flung it into the air, moaning through the gaps in the buildings like a restless spirit. It whipped the brim of Elias's hat against his face and dried the sweat on his neck before it had a chance to offer any relief. The landscape stretching out in every direction was a testament to God's indifference. Arid plains rolled into low, dusty hills without a single tree to break the monotony. The grass was the color of old straw, brittle and sharp, and the sky was a vast, empty bowl of searing blue. It was a place where hope came to die, and Elias understood, with a dull ache in his chest, why he had ended up here. It was a landscape that matched the one inside him. He swung down from his horse in front of the inn, the only 2-story building in town besides the church. The sign above the door, reading "The Weary Traveler," was so faded it was barely legible. The mare let out a low nicker, and Elias ran a hand down her neck, his touch a silent promise of water and feed. He looped the reins around the hitching post and pushed open the door. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, boiled potatoes, and something vaguely medicinal. It was dim, the windows covered in a film of grime that softened the harsh sunlight to a murky yellow. A woman stood behind a long wooden counter, wiping it down with a damp rag. She was not old, but exhaustion had carved deep lines around her eyes and mouth. Her hair, once a warm brown, was streaked with gray and pulled back in a severe bun. "Room for the night?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of welcome. She did not stop her wiping. "And for my horse," Elias said, his own voice a low rasp from the trail. He placed a few coins on the counter. She finally looked up, her gaze assessing him from beneath tired eyelids. She took in the worn duster, the dust-caked boots, the Colt revolver holstered low on his hip. It was a familiar uniform in this part of the country, but his face was what held her attention. It was a quiet face, lean and weathered, with a jaw that was set in a permanent line of grim resolve. But it was his eyes that gave pause. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, settled sorrow that went beyond simple trail weariness. She saw no malice in them, but she saw a capacity for it, a stillness that suggested he was a man who had seen the worst of the world and was no longer surprised by it. "2 bits for the room, 4 for the horse, grain included," she said, finally pushing the rag aside. She slid a key across the counter. "Room 3, top of the stairs. There's a pump out back for water. Stables behind that. My boy, Thomas, will see to your mare." As if on cue, a boy of about 12 limped out from a back room. One of his legs was shorter than the other, bent at an awkward angle, and he leaned heavily on a crude wooden crutch. He had his mother's tired eyes, but a flicker of youthful curiosity in them as he looked at Elias. "This gentleman needs his horse tended to," the woman said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Yes, ma'am," the boy whispered, not quite meeting Elias's gaze. Elias nodded at the boy. "She's a good mare. Answers to Bess. Just needs a good brushing and a full trough." He turned back to the woman. "I'm Elias Walker." "Sarah," she offered, and nothing more. She watched him as he moved toward the stairs, his steps slow but sure. Just before he was out of earshot, she spoke again, her voice low and urgent. "Walker." He stopped, turning his head. "You look like a man who keeps to himself," she said. "Best to keep it that way in Marrow Creek. Stay clear of the church, and stay clear of Silas Croft's men. They own this town, body and soul. The preacher saves the souls, and Croft buries the bodies." Elias held her gaze for a long moment. He had heard variations of the same warning in a dozen other towns. A powerful rancher, a preacher with too much influence. It was the oldest story in the West. He gave a slow, deliberate nod to show he had heard and understood, then continued up the stairs without a word. The warning was meant to be kind. He knew, but it was unnecessary. He had not come looking for trouble. He never did. It just had a way of finding him. His room was small and spare, containing only a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a rickety washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a single window that looked out over the town's dusty main street. He poured some water from the pitcher into the basin and washed the layers of grit from his face and hands. The water was lukewarm and tasted of alkali, but it was wet. As he stared at his reflection in the small, cracked mirror, he saw a stranger. The man looking back was older than his years, his face a map of hard miles and harder memories. He had left a part of himself behind on a battlefield in the war, and another part in a shallow grave beside a river in Texas. What was left was this hollowed-out shell, a man who just kept moving. As evening bled into night, the oppressive heat of the day finally began to recede, replaced by a cool, whispering breeze. The sounds of the town changed. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer fell silent, replaced by the tinny, mournful music from the saloon and the occasional shout of a drunken cowhand. Elias sat on the edge of his bed, cleaning his pistol by the light of a single tallow candle, the familiar ritual a small comfort in an unfamiliar place. He did not go down for a meal. He had jerky and hardtack in his saddlebags, and he had long since lost any appetite for company. Later, when the moon was high and the town had mostly fallen into a drunken, exhausted slumber, a sound drifted through his open window. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the sighing of the wind, but it was rhythmic, a fragile, hitching sound that snagged at the edges of his consciousness. Crying, he rose from the bed and moved to the window, his movements silent. He looked down into the alleyways and shadows of Marrow Creek. The sound was coming from the direction of the church. Its white steeple was a ghostly finger pointing at the star-dusted sky, a monument to a faith that seemed utterly absent from the town below. The sound was stronger now, a soft, desperate weeping that spoke of a pain so profound it could no longer be contained. Curiosity was a luxury he rarely afforded himself. It was a thing that got men killed. His instincts, honed by years of survival, screamed at him to close the window, lie down, and ignore it. It was not his trouble, but the sound was not one of anger or frustration. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated sorrow, the kind of weeping that came from a place of utter hopelessness. It reminded him of another sound, from another lifetime, the sound his fiancée, Clara, had made when she learned her brother had been killed. Against his better judgment, he buckled on his gun belt, grabbed his duster, and slipped out of the room. He moved down the stairs and out the back door of the inn with the quiet grace of a predator, his boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He followed the sound through the darkness, keeping to the shadows. It led him not to the church itself, but to the stables behind it, a dilapidated structure that sagged in the middle like a tired old horse. The weeping was clearer now. Coming from inside, it was a young woman's voice. He paused at the stable door, which hung slightly ajar, and listened. There were no other sounds, no other voices, just the girl and the soft shifting of a lone horse in its stall. He pushed the door open a few more inches. A shaft of pale moonlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of quiet devastation. A young woman was huddled in the corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, her face buried in her arms. She was trying to stifle her sobs, but they escaped in ragged, shuddering breaths. Her dress, a simple, high-collared calico, was torn at the shoulder, and even in the dim light, he could see the dark, ugly bloom of a bruise on her cheekbone. Her hair had come loose from its pins and fell in a tangled curtain around her. She was so consumed by her grief that she had not heard him enter. He did not speak. Words would be an intrusion, a clumsy tool for a wound so delicate. He knew what a frightened animal looked like, and this girl was no different. Any sudden move, any loud noise, would only send her deeper into her fear. He stood there for a long moment, a silent sentinel in the doorway, letting his presence be known without threat. Finally, she must have sensed him. Her weeping hitched and then stopped abruptly. Her head lifted slowly, and her eyes, wide and terrified, found him in the darkness. They were large, dark eyes, and they were swimming with a fear so absolute it stole his breath. He saw the flicker of panic as she tried to make herself smaller, pressing herself further into the corner, as if she could will the shadows to swallow her whole. Elias remained perfectly still. He made no move toward her. He simply held her terrified gaze, his own expression unreadable. He could see the rapid pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. This was Annabeth Cole, the preacher's ward. He had heard her name whispered in the general store earlier, a name spoken with a mixture of pity and contempt. The untouched girl, the pious orphan, looking at her now, trembling in the dirt and straw. He saw that the town's assessment was a cruel joke. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuttoned his duster, the long canvas coat that was his shield against the wind and the rain. He folded it carefully and took a single, slow step into the stable. He placed the coat on a bale of hay a few feet away from her, a silent offering. Then he retreated to the opposite wall, sinking down into a sitting position with his back against the rough-hewn wood. He drew his knees up, rested his forearms on them, and waited. He did not speak her name. He did not ask her what was wrong or who had hurt her. He did not offer empty platitudes of comfort. He simply gave her his presence, a solid, unwavering anchor in the terrifying darkness. He was offering her the one thing he had in abundance: silence. Hours passed. The moon crawled across the sky, its light shifting through the cracks in the stable walls. The lone horse in the stall snorted and stamped its feet. The girl, Annabeth, remained in her corner, her sobs eventually subsiding into silent, shuddering breaths. She watched him, her eyes never leaving his form. She watched as he sat without moving, his gaze directed toward the open doorway, as if he were standing guard. He was not looking at her, not judging her, not demanding anything of her. He was just there. Sometime before dawn, when the chill of the night was at its deepest, she finally moved. Her movements were stiff and slow, like those of a wounded deer. She unfolded herself from her tight ball and crept toward the duster he had left for her. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the heavy fabric, before snatching it and retreating back to her corner. She wrapped the coat around her thin shoulders. It was far too big for her. smelling of dust, leather, and the faint, clean scent of the open plains. She pulled it tight, burying her face in the collar, and for the first time that night, the trembling in her body began to ease. Elias did not acknowledge her movement. He kept his vigil, his gaze fixed on the slowly lightening sky. When the first gray fingers of dawn began to push away the darkness, he rose to his feet. He stretched his stiff limbs and walked to the stable door, pausing to look back at her. She was watching him, her face pale and drawn in the early light. The bruise on her cheek stood out in stark, purple relief. Her eyes were still full of fear, but there was something else in them now, something fragile and questioning. She clutched his coat around her like a shield. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then he was gone, melting back into the shadows of the awakening town as if he had never been there at all. By the time the sun was fully up, the rumors had already begun. A stable hand, arriving early to tend to the preacher's horse, had seen the strange cowboy leaving the church property. Another woman, drawing water from the communal well, swore she saw the preacher's ward, Annabeth, slipping back into the parsonage just after sunrise, wrapped in a man's coat. The stories twisted and grew with each telling, passed in hushed whispers over fences and across the counters of the general store. The mysterious stranger, Elias Walker, had spent the night with the preacher's ward. The town, hungry for any distraction from its own slow decay, feasted on the gossip. He was a drifter, a gunslinger, a man of no account. She was the preacher's sacred charge, a girl meant to be the model of purity and piety for the whole community. The implication was ugly and immediate. He had corrupted her. He had taken advantage of the poor, simple-minded orphan. Elias felt the change in the atmosphere as soon as he stepped out of the inn. The suspicious glances from the day before had curdled into open hostility. Men spat on the ground as he passed. Women gathered their children closer, pulling them away as if he were carrying a plague. He ignored them all, his face a mask of indifference. He went to the stable to check on his mare, and young Thomas, who had been curious the day before, now refused to meet his eye, stammering out a few words before scurrying away. Later, as Elias sat in the corner of the inn's common room, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, the town sheriff pushed through the door. Sheriff Brody was a big man, gone to seed. His gut strained the buttons of his shirt, and his face was perpetually flushed. He carried the weight of his authority with a lazy arrogance, but his eyes were small and shifty, the eyes of a man who served a master other than the law. He strode over to Elias's table, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor. "Walker," he said, his voice a low growl. He did not ask to sit. Elias looked up slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting the sheriff's. He said nothing. "Folks are talking," Brody said, leaning forward and placing his beefy hands on the table. "Talking about you and the preacher's girl. Say you were seen coming from the church stables this morning." Elias took a slow sip of his coffee. He set the cup down with a soft click. "Is that a crime?" he asked, his voice calm and even. The sheriff's face darkened. "It is when it involves Reverend Tate's ward. That girl is a pillar of this community's moral standing. We don't take kindly to drifters coming in and spoiling what's good and pure." "I didn't see much that was good or pure," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. Brody's hand twitched, moving closer to the butt of his pistol. "You got a smart mouth. Walker, I'm asking you simple. What was your business with that girl last night?" Elias leaned back in his chair, the picture of nonchalance, but every muscle in his body was coiled and ready. "My business," he said softly, "is my own." The refusal hung in the air between them, a direct challenge. The sheriff was not used to being challenged, especially not by a stranger with nothing to his name but a horse and a gun. Brody's bluster seemed to falter in the face of Elias's unyielding calm. He searched Elias's eyes for a flicker of fear or guilt, but found nothing but a cold, hard stillness. "You watch your step," Brody finally snarled, pulling back from the table. "I got my eye on you. One wrong move, and you'll find yourself rotting in my jail." He turned and stomped out of the inn, leaving the heavy silence to rush back in. Sarah, the innkeeper, watched from behind the counter, her face etched with worry. She knew what this meant. The sheriff was not his own man. He was a dog on a leash held by Silas Croft and Reverend Tate. Elias had just provoked them both. The final piece fell into place an hour later. As Elias was leaving the inn, a man blocked his path on the boardwalk. It was Reverend Tate himself. He was a tall, thin man with a severe face and eyes that burned with a cold, righteous fire. He dressed in stark black, the only color a small, silver cross pinned to his collar. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid with indignation. "Mr. Walker," the preacher began, his voice smooth and cultured, but with an undercurrent of steel. "I believe you have something that belongs to my niece." Elias knew instantly what he meant. The duster. Annabeth must have kept it. She was cold. Elias said simply. The preacher's thin lips tightened into a bloodless line. "Annabeth is a delicate, impressionable child. She has been through a great trial, losing her parents at such a young age. She is prone to flights of fancy and foolishness. It is my duty, as her guardian and as this town's spiritual shepherd, to protect her from unsavory influences." His eyes raked over Elias, his meaning clear. "Seems to me," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that she needs protecting from more than just influences." A flicker of something dark and violent passed through the preacher's eyes before being swiftly masked by a look of pious sorrow. "You mistake a father's firm hand for cruelty. The girl is willful. She requires discipline for her own salvation. What she does not require is the attention of a man like you, a man with no roots, no faith, and no name worth knowing." The confrontation had drawn an audience. People stopped on the street, watching from a safe distance. Elias could feel their judgment, their eagerness to see the drifter put in his place by the man of God. "Stay away from her," the Reverend commanded, his voice rising for the benefit of the onlookers. "Marrow Creek is a decent, God-fearing town. We will not allow the serpent to enter our garden. I am giving you a charitable warning. Leave this place. Your presence here is an offense." Elias looked past the preacher, his gaze sweeping over the watching faces of the townsfolk. He saw their fear, their suspicion, and their blind obedience. And in his mind, he saw the face of a bruised and terrified girl, huddled in the darkness of a stable. He knew then that leaving was no longer an option. He had not come here looking for a fight, but one had been brought to his door. He had stumbled into something rotten, a darkness hiding behind a steeple, and a part of him that he thought long dead. The part that stood up for those who could not stand for themselves was stirring back to life. He looked back at Reverend Tate, his pale eyes as cold and hard as river stones. He said nothing. He simply stepped around the preacher and walked down the street, the weight of 100 hostile stares on his back. His silence was his answer, and in the dry, desperate town of Marrow Creek, it was a declaration of war. Elias Walker did not leave. His silence was an anchor dropped in the shifting sands of Marrow Creek, a quiet act of defiance that grated on the town's raw nerves. He became a ghost in their midst, a constant, unsettling presence. He took his meals alone at the inn, speaking only to Sarah and her boy, Thomas. He spent his days in the livery, tending to his mare with a meticulous care that bordered on reverence, or sitting in the shade of the blacksmith's shop, watching the town with those still, winter blue eyes. He was waiting, though for what, he did not know. He only knew the image of a bruised girl in a dark stable was burned into his mind, a brand of responsibility he could not ignore. His first move was as silent as his vigil had been. The fence that separated the church property from the alley was broken, a section of it sagging where the wood had rotted through. It was a small thing, a piece of neglect no one had bothered to notice. One afternoon, under the full heat of the sun when the streets were empty. Elias took a hammer and a handful of nails from the blacksmith's scrap pile and repaired it. He worked quickly and efficiently, his movements economical. He replaced the rotted slat with a piece of sound lumber, driving the nails home with clean, powerful strokes. When he was done, the fence was straight and strong. He left without a backward glance, but not before he saw a curtain twitch in an upper window of the parsonage. He knew she watched him. He could feel her gaze on him when he walked the street, a tentative, fearful curiosity. He never looked toward the parsonage, never gave any sign that he knew she was there. To acknowledge her would be to endanger her further. Instead, he continued his campaign of quiet offerings. The next day, he left a small, cloth-wrapped bundle on a post near the stables. Inside was a piece of bread and cheese from his own rations and a shiny red apple he had bought at the general store, an exorbitant luxury in this drought-stricken town. He walked away immediately, leaving the offering to be discovered. For 2 days, it sat untouched. On the third morning, it was gone. His presence began to chafe at the men who followed Reverend Tate and the rancher, Silas Croft. They would shoulder past him on the boardwalk, muttering insults just loud enough to be heard. Elias never rose to the bait. He would simply stop, stand still until they had passed, and then continue on his way. His refusal to react was more infuriating to them than any fistfight could have been. It was a wall of calm they could not breach, and it made them nervous. A week after he had fixed the fence, he sought her out. He waited until the moon was a thin sliver in the sky, and the town was asleep. He found her not in the stables, but by the dry creek bed behind the church, a place of shadows and ghosts. She was sitting on a large, smooth stone, a small, dark shape against the pale earth. She flinched when she saw him approach, her body tensing, ready to flee. He stopped a dozen feet away, making no move to come closer. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice a low rumble that did not carry beyond the space between them. She watched him, her hands clenched in the fabric of her dress. "This world is not a kind place for a person on their own," he continued, speaking to the darkness as much as to her. "A person needs to be able to protect themselves." He reached into his boot and pulled out a small knife. It was not a weapon of war, but a simple utility blade, its wooden handle worn smooth with use. He opened the blade and set the knife on a flat rock between them. "It's sharp, good for cutting rope or for protection if you need it. The handle fits a small hand." He saw the conflict in her eyes, the fear of him, of the weapon, warring with a desperate, unspoken need. "Pick it up," he said gently. "Feel the weight of it." Slowly, hesitantly, she rose and crept forward. Her hand trembled as she reached for the knife. Her fingers closed around the handle, and a small, shuddering breath escaped her lips. It was the first time he had seen her hold anything that might give her power. "The most important thing," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "is to hold it like you mean it. Never show it unless you're prepared to use it. A threat you won't back up is an invitation for more trouble." Over the next few nights, they met in the same spot. He taught her how to hold the knife, how to brace herself, where to strike. The lessons were brief, practical, and devoid of emotion. But in these shared moments of quiet instruction, a fragile trust began to form. He never asked about her bruises, which were slowly fading. He never asked about her uncle. He spoke to her as if she were a capable person, not a broken child. And in return, she began to see him as more than just a fearsome stranger. She saw the deep gentleness hidden beneath his hardened exterior. One night, after he had shown her how to disarm someone who grabbed her wrist, she did not retreat back to her stone. She stood there, clutching the small knife, her knuckles white. "Why?" she whispered, the single word so soft he almost did not hear it. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. "Why what? Why are you helping me?" Elias looked away, his gaze settling on the distant, dark line of the hills. Because no one else is. The simple, brutal honesty of his answer seemed to undo something inside her. A tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. They think I'm a fool, she said, her voice trembling. A simple girl who needs the Reverend's guidance. They don't know. They don't want to know. He remained silent. Letting her speak, he knew this was a dam that had been holding back years of pain, and it had to break on its own terms. He raised me after my parents died, she began, her words coming in a halting rush. He said the world was full of sin, and that a woman's soul was a battlefield. He said my parents were too lenient, that they had let my spirit grow wild and untamed. So he tamed it. She looked down at her hands. Every book I read had to be approved by him. Every person I spoke to, every thought I had was a potential sin. He would read passages from the Bible, the ones about righteous punishment and the wickedness of the flesh. And his eyes, they would shine. She took a shaky breath. Last year, there was a fever. It swept through town. I got sick, so sick I couldn't stand. He refused to let the doctor see me. He said it was a test of faith, that my body was a vessel for sin, and the fever was God's way of burning it clean. He locked me in my room and prayed outside the door while I thought I was dying. The doctor's wife, Mrs. Gable. She tried to intervene. He told her I was in spiritual quarantine, and that to interfere would be to defy God's will. The town believed him. When the fever finally broke, he held a special service, praising the Lord for my recovery, for my purity being affirmed by the trial. Her voice broke. He didn't save me. He let me suffer. He wanted to see if I would break. He wanted to be the one who owned my soul when it was over. Elias felt a cold, murderous rage build in his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself to feel in years. It was an old, familiar poison. He kept his face impassive, his body perfectly still, knowing that any sign of his own anger would silence her. "The night you found me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mr. Croft's son, Jed, he spoke to me after the evening service. He was just being friendly. But the Reverend saw. He dragged me to the stables. He said I was inviting damnation, that I was a harlot in the making. He hit me. He said he had to beat the sin out of me before it took root." Elias closed his eyes. The image of her, bruised and weeping, was now layered with the full weight of her story. It was not a single act of violence, but a lifetime of slow, methodical cruelty. All of it cloaked in the sanctimonious robes of religion. He understood now the depth of her fear, the reason for her silence. Her spirit was not wild or untamed. It was a bird that had been kept in a cage so long it had forgotten how to fly. Yet, she had survived. That small, stubborn spark of resilience he saw in her was a miracle. It drew him in with a force that both frightened and compelled him. In her quiet strength, he saw a purity that men like Tate could never touch, let alone understand. As she spoke, the ghosts of his own past rose up to meet him. He saw the face of his fiancée, Clara, her eyes bright with laughter as they stood on a hill overlooking the small piece of land they had bought together. It had been good land, with a creek that ran year-round and a stand of cottonwoods for shade. "We'll build the house right here, Elias," she had said, her hand in his, "where we can see the sunrise." But the land bordered the vast cattle empire of a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne had claimed their creek was on his property, a lie backed by a forged deed and a hired judge. Elias had tried to fight it with the law, but the law belonged to Thorne. One evening, Thorne's men had ridden down to their homestead. They were there to deliver a final warning. Clara had been alone. She had stood on the porch of their half-built house, unafraid, and told them to get off her land. Someone fired a shot, a warning shot, they claimed later, but it struck her in the chest. The memory hit Elias like a physical blow, a phantom pain that echoed the real one. He had found her there, the setting sun turning the dust around her to gold. her blood a dark stain on the new pine boards. The light had gone out of his world in that moment. He had hunted the men down, not for revenge, he told himself, but for justice. He found the man who fired the shot in a saloon 2 towns over. The man was drunk, bragging about scaring the homesteader's woman. Elias had called him out. The man had drawn his gun. But Elias was faster. His shot was true. The man was dead before he hit the floor. But as he lay there, another man, the man's brother, had come up from behind and smashed a bottle over Elias's head. Dazed and bleeding, Elias had fired again, wildly. That second shot went astray, striking an innocent bystander, a young farmer who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. A warrant was issued, not for the killing of Thorne's man, but for the death of the farmer, Elias Walker. Wanted for murder. He had been running ever since. He ran from the law, from the memory of Clara's lifeless face, and from the ghost of the innocent man he had killed. The weight of it had shaped him into the silent, guarded man who now stood in the darkness with a broken girl. He saw in Reverend Tate the same arrogant cruelty as Marcus Thorne, the same belief that the world and everyone in it belonged to them. And he felt the same old rage beginning to stir. The turning point came on a Sunday. A week later, the air was thick with heat and the drone of flies. The whole of Marrow Creek was gathered for the morning service. Elias was not in the church. He was across the street, watching from the shadows of the livery. He watched as the congregation filed out after the sermon, their faces scrubbed clean and pious. They gathered in the churchyard, making small talk, the women fanning themselves, the men talking of the drought. He saw Annabeth emerge, trailing a few steps behind Reverend Tate and his wife. Her head was bowed, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked pale and fragile, a wraith in a plain gray dress. Silas Croft's son, Jed, a young man with a kinder face than his father's, approached her. He said something to her, a simple greeting from the look of it, and offered her a small wildflower he had picked. Annabeth hesitated, her eyes darting toward her uncle. For a brief second, she reached for the flower, a flicker of a smile touching her lips. It was enough. Reverend Tate saw the exchange. His face, which had been arranged in a mask of pleasant piety, twisted into a venomous snarl. He strode over, grabbed Annabeth by the upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh, and wrenched her away from the young man. "Get inside, girl," he hissed, his voice low but vibrating with fury. He dragged her around the side of the church, away from the prying eyes of the townsfolk, toward the back where the stables stood. But Elias was already moving. He had seen the look on the preacher's face, and it was a look he recognized. It was the look of a man about to indulge in a secret, vicious pleasure. Elias cut through the alley, his boots silent in the thick dust. He reached the back corner of the church just in time to hear the sharp, ugly sound of a hand striking flesh. He rounded the corner and saw it. Tate had Annabeth pressed against the wall. Her head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. A red mark was already blooming on her cheek. "You shameless creature," the preacher spat, raising his hand again. "To flaunt yourself like a common trollop in the Lord's own house." His hand never landed. Elias's arm shot out, his fingers wrapping around the preacher's wrist in a grip of iron. He stopped the blow inches from Annabeth's face. Reverend Tate gasped, more in shock than in pain, and spun around. His eyes went wide when he saw Elias. "You!" he choked out, struggling against the unyielding grip. "Unhand me! This is not your concern!" "You lay a hand on her again," Elias said, his voice a lethal whisper. "And I will break it." He squeezed, and the preacher let out a pained cry as the bones in his wrist ground together. "She requires discipline. She is my charge, given to me by God." "God has nothing to do with this," Elias said, his voice cold. He shoved the preacher back, sending him stumbling away from Annabeth. Elias immediately stepped between them, shielding her with his body. She was trembling violently. A hand pressed to her cheek, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief. The commotion had drawn attention. People began to drift around the corner of the church, their curiosity piqued by the preacher's cry. They stopped dead when they saw the scene. The stranger, Elias Walker, standing over their revered preacher, his stance radiating a deadly menace. Reverend Tate, seeing his audience, straightened his coat and regained a measure of his composure. He pointed a trembling finger at Elias. "This man," he shouted, his voice ringing with righteous fury. "This drifter, this agent of sin, has assaulted a man of God. He has been poisoning my niece's mind with his wickedness." The crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of confusion and anger. They saw what they were told to see, their spiritual leader being threatened by a dangerous outsider. But Elias did not look at the preacher. His gaze went past him, to the crowd. He looked at the faces of the women, at the men, at the children. Then he looked at Annabeth, who was still pressed against the wall, her silent tears tracking paths through the dust on her face. He raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting it with a quiet authority that cut through the preacher's hysterics. "I saw him strike her," Elias said, his words clear and deliberate. "I saw this man of God raise his hand to a defenseless girl. I want you all to look at the mark on her face." Heads turned. Eyes shifted from the preacher to the girl. For the first time, they were not just looking at the preacher's ward. They were truly seeing her. They saw the fresh, red welt on her cheek. They saw her torn dress from the night he first found her. They saw the terror in her eyes, a terror that had been there all along, hidden behind a mask of piety. "Ask yourselves," Elias continued, his voice resonating with a cold, hard truth. "Is this God's work? Is this how a shepherd tends his flock? With a closed fist behind the church where no one can see." A wave of uncertainty rippled through the crowd. Whispers erupted. Women looked at each other, a dawning horror in their eyes. Some of them had seen the preacher's temper before, had heard the stories, but had dismissed them, had chosen to believe in the sanctity of his position. Now, the evidence was undeniable, presented to them in the bright, unforgiving light of day. The town was split down the middle. Some glared at Elias, their faith in their preacher unshakable. They saw him as a devil, a liar sent to test them. Others looked at Reverend Tate with new, questioning eyes. They saw a cruel man hiding behind a cross. Annabeth, the silent, invisible girl, was suddenly at the center of it all. And Elias Walker, the quiet stranger, had just lit a fuse in the dry, dusty powder keg of Marrow Creek. The public shaming of Reverend Tate shattered the Sunday peace of Marrow Creek. The town, once united in its misery and suspicion, was now fractured. The preacher's word, once as solid as the rock upon which his church was built, had been chipped away. Yet faith, especially when it is all a town has left, is a stubborn and powerful thing. For every person who saw the truth in Annabeth's bruised face, there was another who saw only the devil's work in Elias Walker's defiance. Reverend Tate moved swiftly. Power, he knew, abhorred a vacuum, and any doubt left to fester would grow into a weed that could choke his authority. He did not need to convince the whole town, only the right parts of it. He conferred with Silas Croft, the rancher whose cattle grazed on land that had once belonged to smaller, now vanished homesteaders. He conferred with Sheriff Brody, a man whose salary was paid by the town, but whose loyalty was bought by Croft. A plan was forged in the heat of their collective indignation. The next morning, Sheriff Brody, flanked by two of Croft's largest ranch hands deputized for the occasion, strode into the inn. Elias was sitting at his usual table, a cup of coffee in his hands. He had known something like this was coming. He had seen the way the shadows gathered. "Elias Walker," Brody announced, his voice booming with false authority. "You're under arrest." Elias did not move. He looked up at the sheriff, his expression unreadable. "On what charge?" "Theft," Brody said, a smug look on his face. Reverend Tate has reported the theft of the church's poor box. $50, meant for the widows and orphans of this town. A witness saw you lurking around the church late last night. It was a perfect accusation. It was clean, simple, and diabolical. It painted Elias not as a defender of a girl, but as a man who would steal from the most vulnerable. It was a lie so venomous it could poison the entire well of public opinion. I was in my room all night, Elias said calmly. Ask Sarah. The innkeeper is your friend, Brody sneered. Her word is no good. Now stand up, nice and slow. Elias knew better than to resist. To do so here would only get him killed. He placed his hands on the table and rose slowly to his feet. One of the deputies moved in quickly and unbuckled his gun belt, removing his only means of defense. As they led him out onto the street, the town was there to watch. It was a spectacle, orchestrated by the preacher. They were marching him toward the small, squalid jailhouse when a cry cut through the air. Stop! He didn't do it! It was Annabeth. She had run from the parsonage, her hair flying loose around her face. She stood in the middle of the street, her small frame trembling, but her eyes blazing with a fire no one had ever seen in them before. Reverend Tate and his wife were right behind her, their faces masks of fury and alarm. He is not a thief, Annabeth cried, her voice thin but carrying in the stunned silence. He's a good man. He helped me. Sheriff Brody paused, clearly uncertain. This was not part of the plan. Annabeth took another step forward, her gaze fixed on the crowd. The Reverend is lying. He lies about everything. He hurts me. He locks me up and says it's for my own good, but it's for his own pride. Elias is the only one who has ever shown me kindness. It was the bravest act of her life. Every word was a stone pulled from the wall of silence she had built around herself. For the first time, she was speaking her own truth, in her own voice, for all the world to hear. The effect was electric. The crowd gasped. This was no longer just about a drifter and a stolen poor box. This was about the very soul of their town. But the preacher was faster. He and his wife descended on Annabeth like vultures. The girl is hysterical, Reverend Tate shouted, grabbing her arm. She doesn't know what she is saying. This man has twisted her mind with his sinful lies. She is unwell. His wife took her other arm. Come now, Annabeth, you need to rest. The excitement has been too much for your delicate constitution. They physically overpowered her, dragging her back toward the parsonage as she struggled. It's the truth, she screamed, her voice breaking with sobs. Please, listen to me. No one moved to help her. They were farmers, ranchers, and shopkeepers, not heroes. They were afraid of the preacher, afraid of Croft, and afraid of the disruption of the known order. They watched as the parsonage door swallowed her up, and her voice was silenced once more. Sheriff Brody shoved Elias forward. See what you've done! Drove that poor girl mad! Get in the cell! The jail was a single room with 2 barred cells. It smelled of sweat, despair, and cheap whiskey. Brody slammed the iron door shut, the sound echoing with a grim finality. Elias was left alone in the gloom. The accusations of the preacher and the desperate, silenced cries of Annabeth ringing in his ears. He had tried to help her, and in doing so, he had only managed to get himself caged and her voice stolen again. A familiar, bitter wave of failure washed over him. He spent the day and the next night in that cell. From his small, barred window, he could see a slice of the town, of the merciless blue sky. He knew what his fate would be. A traveling judge was not due for months. By then, any truth of the matter would be buried under a mountain of the preacher's lies. He would be found guilty and hanged, or sent to a territorial prison from which no one ever returned. His life would end here, in this dusty, God-forsaken town, not for the crime he had committed years ago, but for a crime he hadn't. On the second night, long after the town had gone quiet, he heard a faint scratching sound near the jailhouse door. He rose from the cot and moved to the bars. In the sliver of moonlight that fell on the floor, He saw a key being pushed under the main door. A moment later, the door creaked open, and a small figure slipped inside. It was Thomas, the innkeeper's son. His face was pale with fear, his eyes wide in the darkness. He held up the key to Elias's cell, his hand shaking. "My ma, she said what they're doing isn't right," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "She saw the preacher hit that girl before. Everyone's just too scared to say it." Elias looked at the boy, at his crippled leg and his terrified but determined face. It was the second small act of impossible courage he had witnessed in as many days. "You'll be in a world of trouble if they find you," Elias said, his voice low. "You gotta go," Thomas insisted, fumbling with the lock. "Your horse is saddled and tied up behind the livery. Ma left you a bag with some food and water. You gotta go now, before the deputy wakes up." The lock clicked open. Elias pushed the cell door and stepped out, placing a hand on the boy's thin shoulder. "Thank you, Thomas. I won't forget this." He moved like a wraith out of the jailhouse and into the night. The sleeping town was a maze of dark, menacing shapes. He found his mare, Bess, just as the boy had said. A canvas sack was tied to the saddle. He swung himself up, the worn leather familiar and comforting beneath him. He had to get clear of the town, lose himself in the wilderness before they raised the alarm. He urged the mare into a silent walk, heading for the open plains, but his luck had run out. As he passed a dark alley, a dog, sensing his presence, erupted into a frenzy of barking. A light appeared in a window. A man shouted. The alarm had been raised. Elias spurred Bess into a gallop, the sound of her hooves thundering in the quiet night. A gunshot cracked behind him, the bullet whining past his ear. He bent low over the horse's neck, pushing her harder, faster, into the vast, dark wilderness. He did not look back. The landscape that had been his refuge now became his enemy. He rode for hours, pushing the mare through a treacherous terrain of rocky outcrops and thorny brush. The posse would be after him at first light, and he needed to put as much distance as possible between himself and Marrow Creek. In the pre-dawn gloom, disaster struck. As Bess scrambled down a steep, shale-covered embankment, her footing gave way. She went down, and Elias was thrown clear. He landed hard, his leg twisting beneath him, his shin scraping against the razor-sharp edge of a rock. A searing pain shot up his leg. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to his feet. Bess was struggling to rise, her flank scraped but her legs sound. He grabbed the reins, his own leg screaming in protest. He looked down and saw a long, deep gash below his knee, the blood welling up dark and thick in the moonlight. He had no time to tend to it. He could already hear the distant sound of baying hounds. They had put trackers on his trail. He pulled himself back into the saddle, a wave of dizziness washing over him from the pain. He rode on, forcing himself to ignore the throbbing in his leg. The sky to the east was beginning to turn a bruised purple, and a new threat was gathering. Dark, heavy clouds were rolling in from the west, blotting out the stars. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an electric tension. The coming storm was a blessing and a curse. The rain would wash away his trail, but it would also chill him to the bone and turn the dry earth into a treacherous sea of mud. The first drops of rain began to fall as he found a desperate sort of shelter, a narrow ravine carved into the side of a rocky mesa. It was little more than a deep scar in the earth, littered with boulders and tangled brush. At the far end, he found a shallow overhang, a small cave worn into the rock by centuries of wind and water. It was not much, but it would have to do. He led Bess into the relative cover of the ravine and collapsed against the cave wall. His injured leg stretched out in front of him. The gash was caked with dirt and still oozing blood. The pain was a relentless, grinding agony. The heavens opened. The rain came down not in drops but in solid, driving sheets, turning the ravine into a churning river of red mud. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky. followed by claps of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Elias closed his eyes, surrendering to the pain and the exhaustion. He had escaped the jail, but he was wounded, hunted, and now trapped by the storm. He was no better off than he had been before. He must have drifted into a haze of pain and fever, because he thought he was dreaming when he heard her voice. "Elias?" It was a whisper, almost lost in the roar of the storm. His eyes snapped open. She was standing at the mouth of the cave, soaked to the skin, her dress torn and plastered to her body, her face scratched and smudged with mud. It was Annabeth. He stared at her, unable to believe what he was seeing. "Annabeth? How?" "I saw which way you rode," she said, her teeth chattering from the cold. She scrambled into the cave, her eyes falling on his injured leg. A small gasp escaped her lips. "You're hurt." She had a small bundle clutched in her hands, wrapped in oilcloth. She opened it to reveal a clean strip of linen, a small bottle of carbolic, and a piece of bread. She had run from the parsonage, had followed him on foot, alone, through the night and into the unforgiving wilderness. Without a word, she knelt beside him in the flickering, intermittent light of the storm. She tore a piece from her own sodden petticoat and gently began to clean the wound. He flinched as the rough cloth touched his raw flesh, a hiss of pain escaping his lips. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her touch becoming more tender. She poured the carbolic over the gash, and he gritted his teeth against the searing, cleansing fire. He watched her as she worked, her face a mask of intense concentration. The fire he had seen in her eyes in the middle of the street was still there, but it was softer now, banked into a steady, determined glow. She was no longer just the preacher's ward, the frightened girl from the stables. She was a woman who had crossed miles of wilderness in a storm to find him. When she was done cleaning the wound, she bound it tightly with a strip of linen. She worked in silence, the only sounds the howl of the wind and the relentless drumming of the rain. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, her small frame shivering in the damp cold. He had a single dry match in a waterproof tin in his pocket. He managed to find a handful of dry twigs and tinder deep in a crevice of the cave. With painstaking effort, he coaxed a tiny flame to life, feeding it until it grew into a small, sputtering fire. The meager light pushed back the darkness, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. It threw a warm, golden glow on her face, illuminating the exhaustion and the fear, but also the fierce, unwavering resolve. They sat in silence for a long time, sharing the small warmth of the fire. The storm raged outside, a wild, elemental fury that sealed them in their small sanctuary. "Finally," she looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You can't leave," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't leave me here." It was not a question, but a desperate plea. After what I said, I don't know what he'll do. You're the only one. Please, don't leave me alone." Her raw vulnerability was a blow to his heart, more painful than the gash in his leg. He saw in her the same terror of abandonment that had haunted him for years. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, wanting to comfort her, to pull her close and shield her from all the cruelty of the world. But he stopped. His hand fell back to his side, to touch her now, when she was so frightened and vulnerable, would be to take advantage of her desperation. It would make him no better than the preacher, who used her fear to control her. He looked at her, his throat tight with a feeling so powerful it almost choked him. It was more than desire, more than tenderness. It was a profound, aching reverence for the incredible spirit of the woman sitting before him. He whispered her name, the sound a raw, broken thing, torn from the deepest part of him. Annabeth. It was not just a name, but a prayer. It was an acknowledgement of her strength, her courage, her very being. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "Please," she begged again, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't," he said, his own voice hoarse. "I won't leave you, but I won't touch you. Not like this. Not while you're running scared. When you're free, truly free, by your own choice and in your own time, then you can decide. But until then, I'll just be here. I promise." He saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, and with it, a wave of emotion so intense it left her breathless. He was not offering her passion. He was offering her something far more precious, something she had never known. He was offering her respect. He was protecting not just her body, but her soul. She moved closer to the fire, huddling near him for warmth, but not touching. They sat there through the long night as lightning split the sky, two wounded souls sheltering in a cave. The storm outside was matched by the storm of unspoken feelings between them. There was no physical consummation, only a painful, aching restraint, and the quiet power of a whispered promise. In the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, their connection deepened, forged not in a moment of passion, but in a shared moment of profound and heartbreaking emotional closeness. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. The air in the ravine was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage. Elias's leg throbbed with a dull, insistent rhythm, but the fever had broken. Annabeth had slept fitfully, huddled on the other side of the dying fire, wrapped in his still damp duster. In the pale morning light, she looked impossibly young and fragile, yet the set of her jaw was anything but— "The posse will come back when the ground dries," Elias said, his voice a rough rasp. He had been watching her for some time, this girl who had walked through a tempest for him. "We need to move." "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. There was no panic in it now, only a weary pragmatism. "Away from here, north, maybe. Find a place where the law isn't for sale." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. It was what he always did. He ran. She shook her head, a small, resolute movement. "No, not this time. Running is what he wants. He'll tell the town I ran off with you, that you corrupted me and stole me away. He'll make me the sinner and himself the victim. He'll win. The story will be set in stone, and I'll still be his prisoner, even 100 miles from here." Elias looked at her, truly looked at her. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cold, hard anger. The fire he had seen was now a forge. She had not followed him into the wilderness for rescue, but for alliance. "There is no fighting him, Annabeth," he said, the words heavy with the weight of his own past failures. "He has the law, the money, and the town's fear on his side. We have nothing." "That's not true," she said, reaching into the sodden bundle she had carried, from beneath the medical supplies. She pulled out a small packet of letters, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a faded ribbon. "I found these years ago, hidden in a loose floorboard in my mother's old room. They're from her, written to her sister not long after they took me in. I took them with me when I ran. I didn't know why. I just knew I couldn't leave them." She handed them to him. His hands were clumsy as he untied the ribbon. The paper was thin and brittle, the ink faded but legible. He read the delicate, looping script of a woman writing to her sister, a voice from the grave. The early letters were full of hope, of gratitude that her orphaned daughter had a good, Christian home. But the tone shifted. The words became tinged with worry, then outright fear. "He is so strict with the child," one passage read. "He speaks of breaking her will as if it were a wild horse. He calls it salvation. I call it cruelty. I saw a bruise on her arm today, and he told me she had fallen, but she does not look at me anymore. Sister, her eyes are always on the floor." Another letter, the last one, was filled with a desperate urgency. "I fear for her spirit. He is crushing it. He speaks of her purity with a possessive fire that is not godly. I am afraid of what he will do to keep her unspoiled, for the world. He is not a shepherd. He is a jailer." Elias folded the letters carefully. This was not just Annabeth's word against the preachers. This was her mother's testimony. A damning indictment from beyond the grave. It was proof of a long, calculated campaign of cruelty. "There's a traveling judge," Annabeth said, her voice gaining strength. "Judge Miller. He's due in Marrow Creek any day. They say he's a hard man, but fair. He doesn't answer to men like Croft or Tate. If we can get these to him, if I can speak to him, maybe he will listen." It was a desperate plan, a long shot aimed at the heart of the town's corruption. To return to Marrow Creek was to walk back into the lion's den. But as he looked at Annabeth, at the unbending will in her eyes, he knew he could not ask her to run. Her freedom wasn't in some distant territory. It was here, in this town, in the reclamation of her own voice. "All right," he said, the word a vow. "We go back." They returned under the cloak of a moonless night, moving through the shadows like fugitives. Elias's leg was a torment, each step a fresh agony, but he leaned on Annabeth's small, steady shoulder, and she did not falter. They did not go to the main street, but slipped through the back alleys to the rear entrance of the inn. Sarah opened the door before they could knock, her face a relief map of worry. She pulled them inside, into the warm, lamp-lit kitchen. Her son, Thomas, stood behind her, his eyes wide. "We thought the posse had you," Sarah whispered, bolting the door behind them. She took in Elias's pale face and blood-soaked bandage, the scratches on Annabeth's cheeks. "Dear Lord, you need a doctor." "No doctor," Elias said through gritted teeth. "Just a place to lie low. And information?" "The judge is here," Sarah said, confirming Annabeth's hope. "Judge Miller arrived yesterday. He's holding court in the morning at the saloon, of all places. He said it's the most honest building in town." She tended to Elias's leg with practiced hands, cleaning and redressing the wound while Annabeth told her about the letters. Sarah read them, her lips tightening into a thin, angry line. "I knew it," she said, her voice shaking with quiet rage. "I always knew there was something wrong in that house. A man's piety should make him gentle, not cruel." The inn became their sanctuary and their headquarters. For the next 2 days, Elias rested, gathering his strength, while a subtle shift began to occur in the town. The seeds of doubt that Annabeth had planted with her public outburst began to sprout in the dark, fertile ground of shared secrets. Sarah was the one who tilled the soil. She spoke quietly to other women when they came to the inn for supplies or news. She started with the doctor's wife, Mrs. Gable, a woman who had never forgiven the preacher for denying her access to a sick child. Mrs. Gable listened, her face growing grim. "I tried to tell my husband," she confided in a low voice. "He said it was the Reverend's right as a guardian, that we shouldn't interfere with God's will. But it never felt like God's will to me. It felt like a man's pride." The conversation was repeated in sewing circles and over backyard fences. A murmur began to ripple through the female population of Marrow Creek. Another woman confessed that the preacher had shamed her from the pulpit for being too friendly with a traveling salesman. A young widow admitted that he had refused her a place in the church choir because her period of mourning was not, in his estimation, sufficiently pious. Each story was a small thing on its own, a minor act of spiritual tyranny, but woven together, they created a dark and suffocating tapestry. The men remained largely oblivious, talking of cattle prices and the coming harvest. But the women of the town were beginning to stir. They saw in Annabeth's story a reflection of their own smaller, unspoken submissions. The plan was for Annabeth to approach Judge Miller, supported by Sarah and Mrs. Gable, and present the letters. But Elias knew it wouldn't be enough. Tate was a master manipulator. He would discredit the letters, claim Annabeth was a hysterical, lying child, and that the other women were just gossips. They needed to force the issue, to create a public crisis so profound that the judge would have no choice but to see the truth. On Sunday, Elias knew what he had to do. He rose from his bed, his legs stiff and painful, but his purpose clear. He strapped on the gun belt that Thomas had rescued from the sheriff's office. Annabeth watched him, her eyes full of fear. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to make sure he listens," he said. He took the packet of letters from her. "Your part comes after. You have to be strong. You have to lead them." He left her at the inn and walked, limping heavily, down the main street of Marrow Creek. The town was quiet. The good citizens all gathered in the church for the Sunday sermon. He did not go to the main entrance. He went to the livery, where he found a can of kerosene. He entered the church through a side door, slipping into the back pew unnoticed. Reverend Tate was in the pulpit, his voice ringing with passion and authority. He was preaching about the serpent in the garden, about the insidious nature of sin that could creep into a community, disguised as a stranger, and poison the innocent. His eyes swept over his congregation, and Elias could see the fear and devotion on their faces. They were in his thrall. Elias stood up. He walked down the central aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. Every head turned. A collective gasp went through the room. He was a ghost they thought they had exorcised. He walked until he stood directly below the pulpit, his cold blue eyes meeting the preacher's shocked and furious gaze. "You're a liar," Elias said, his voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the silent church. He held up the letters in one hand and the can of kerosene in the other. Reverend Tate's face turned purple with rage. "Blasphemy! Sheriff, remove this man from God's house!" Sheriff Brody, sitting in the front pew with Silas Croft, lumbered to his feet. Two of Croft's men rose with him. "These are letters," Elias said, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "From Annabeth's mother. They tell a different story than the one you preach. They tell of a cruel man who hides his pride behind the word of God. They tell of bruises and a spirit you've been trying to break since she was a child." He unscrewed the cap of the kerosene can. The sharp, volatile smell filled the air. "I think this whole church is built on a lie, and sometimes the only way to get rid of a lie is to burn it to the ground." Panic erupted. People screamed and scrambled for the doors. Sheriff Brody and his men, however, were not running. They were advancing on Elias. "He's gone mad!" Tate shrieked from the pulpit. "Stop him!" Brody lunged for him. Elias sidestepped, bringing the heavy can around and catching the sheriff in the side of the head. Brody went down with a grunt, but the other two men were on him. A fist slammed into his jaw, snapping his head back. Another fist buried itself in his gut, driving the air from his lungs. His injured leg gave way, and he fell to his knees. He didn't let go of the letters. He was vaguely aware of boots kicking him in the ribs, of a searing pain that exploded in his head. His vision blurred. He had done what he came to do. He had created the crisis. The rest was up to her. He curled into a ball, protecting the letters with his body, and surrendered to the violent, thudding darkness. The chaos of the church spilled out into the street just as Judge Miller was stepping out of the saloon, a cup of coffee in his hand. He was a tall, grim-faced man with eyes that missed nothing. He saw the panicked congregation, the smoke-like smell of kerosene, and the sight of Sheriff Brody's men dragging a nearly unconscious Elias from the church. Then he saw something else. Annabeth was walking toward him. She was not alone. Behind her was Sarah, the innkeeper, and Mrs. Gable, the doctor's wife, and behind them were a dozen other women, their faces pale but resolute. They moved as one body, a silent, determined procession that parted the frightened crowd. They stopped before the judge, and the street fell utterly silent. Annabeth stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "Judge Miller," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My name is Annabeth Cole. I am the ward of Reverend Tate, and I would like to make a statement." The judge looked from her clear, defiant eyes to the beaten form of Elias Walker, and then to the furious, sputtering face of Reverend Tate, who was now rushing out of the church. "This is a town matter, Judge," Tate began. "This man is a violent criminal, and the girl is not in her right mind." "Silence," Judge Miller said. his voice like the crack of a whip. He turned his full attention to Annabeth. "Speak, child. I am listening." And so she did. She stood there, in the middle of the dusty street, and she gave her testimony. She spoke of the years of silence, of the emotional abuse disguised as piety, of the fevers and the beatings. Her voice, once a frightened whisper, rang with the undeniable power of the truth. When she was done, Mrs. Gable stepped forward and spoke of the locked room and the sick child she was forbidden to treat. Then Sarah spoke of the fear she saw in Annabeth's eyes. One by one, the other women spoke, their voices adding to the chorus, telling their own small stories of shame and intimidation. It was a floodgate of repressed truth, and it washed away the foundations of Reverend Tate's authority. The men in the crowd, who had seen only a pious leader, now looked at him through their wives' eyes and saw a tyrant. Judge Miller listened to it all, his expression unreadable. When the last woman had spoken, he turned his cold, hard gaze on the preacher. "Reverend Tate," he said, his voice flat and devoid of mercy, "under the authority of this territory, I am placing you under arrest for the repeated and cruel abuse of your ward, Annabeth Cole." Tate's face crumbled, his righteous mask falling away to reveal a petty, terrified man. "You can't," he stammered. "I am a man of God." "It would appear God has little to do with your conduct," the judge said dryly. He nodded to one of his own men, a federal marshal who had been standing by. "Take him." As the marshal clamped irons on the preacher's wrists, Tate's eyes found Elias, who was now being helped to his feet by a few townsmen who had suddenly found their courage. The preacher's face twisted into a final, venomous sneer. He spat on the ground near Elias's feet. "She was never yours to save," he hissed, his voice full of poison. Then he was led away, a fallen prophet in a town that had finally woken from its long and troubled sleep. In the days that followed the preacher's arrest, a heavy, unnatural quiet settled over Marrow Creek. It was not the quiet of peace, but the hush of a house where a bitter argument has just ended, leaving the air thick with unspoken resentments and shame. The violent climax had lanced a boil, but the poison remained. Seeping into the soil of the town, people moved about their daily chores with their eyes downcast, avoiding conversations that might lead back to that terrible Sunday. The church stood empty, its doors closed, its steeple no longer a symbol of hope, but a monument to a profound betrayal. The town had been split open, its ugly secrets laid bare for all to see. The women who had spoken out found themselves in a strange new territory. Some were met with quiet nods of support from their husbands and neighbors, but others faced a cold wall of resentment. They had disrupted the order of things, had aired the town's dirty laundry for an outsider, a judge, to see. They had shamed their community. The fault lines were not clean. They ran through homes, between friends, and down the middle of the general store. Marrow Creek was a town at war with its own reflection, and it did not like what it saw. Elias Walker, the catalyst for it all, was kept at the inn. His name was now spoken in hushed tones, a mixture of awe and fear. He was the man who had faced down the preacher, the gunslinger who had threatened to burn down the church, the savior who had been beaten nearly to death on its holy ground. Sarah tended to his wounds, her face a grim mask of efficiency, while Thomas watched him with an open, hero-worshipping gaze. Elias, for his part, said little. He lay on the narrow bed in his small room, his body a map of bruises and aches, and listened to the silence of the town. He felt no triumph, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. On the third day, he had a visitor. Judge Miller appeared at his door, his tall frame filling the doorway. He was not in his robes of office, but in simple, practical clothes. He entered the room and sat on the single rickety chair without being invited. "You look like hell, son," the judge said, his voice a gravelly rumble. Elias pushed himself up slowly, his ribs protesting with a sharp, grinding pain. "I feel like I've been kicked to death by a mule." "That's about the size of it," Miller agreed. He looked around the small, spare room. "I finished my business here. Tate will be sent to the territorial prison. He'll be breaking rocks for the next 20 years. Sheriff Brody has been relieved of his duties. I suspect he'll be long gone by sundown. As for Silas Croft, there's nothing I can pin on him. But a man like that doesn't last long once his pet preacher and his puppet sheriff are gone. The fear is broken." The judge leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Which leaves the problem of this town. It needs a lawman. Not a bully like Brody, but a man who understands the difference between the law and justice. A man who isn't afraid to stand up to the likes of Tate and Croft. A man like you." He reached into his coat and produced a small, silver star. He placed it on the washstand next to Elias's bed. "I'm offering you the job. The town council will approve it. They're scared enough to do whatever I say." Elias looked at the badge. It glinted in the dim light, a small, potent symbol of order and authority. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine it. A life here, a home, a place to stop running, a chance to be near Annabeth, to watch her heal, to see her smile. The pull of it was so strong it was a physical ache in his chest. But the ghosts were still there. The ghost of Clara. The ghost of the innocent farmer he had killed. The ghost of the man he used to be. And the warrant. The warrant was still out there. A shadow that would follow him wherever he went. To pin on a badge would be to live a lie. To stand for a law that would hang him if it ever knew his real story. He shook his head slowly. "I'm not a lawman. Judge." "You could have fooled me," Miller said dryly. "What I did, that wasn't about the law," Elias said, his voice quiet. "The law is about rules and words on a piece of paper. Justice. Justice is about what's right in your gut. It's about standing between a wolf and a lamb because you have to. I don't want to wear it. Justice has to be lived, not worn." The judge looked at him for a long, silent moment. He saw the truth in Elias's pale, haunted eyes. He saw the irrevocable past that the man carried with him. He nodded slowly, a sign of understanding and respect. "As you wish," he said, taking the badge from the stand and slipping it back into his pocket. "But the world needs more men like you. Walker, even if they don't wear a star." He stood to leave. "What will you do now?" "What I always do," Elias said. "Move on." While Elias was making his decision, Annabeth was lost in a wilderness of a different kind. Judge Miller had made her a ward of the town, placing her under the temporary care of Sarah at the inn until a more permanent arrangement could be made, perhaps with a family in a different county. The parsonage, the site of her entire life's confinement, was now hers to do with as she pleased. But freedom, she was discovering, was a vast, terrifying emptiness. She spent her days in the silent house, moving from room to room like a ghost. The silence that had once been a rare and precious commodity was now a crushing weight. She had prayed for it, longed for it. But now that it was here, it offered no peace. Every object in the house was a reminder of her uncle's tyranny. The heavy, dark furniture, the stern-faced portraits on the walls, the Bible on its stand in the parlor, its pages filled with the passages he had used as weapons against her. She was free, but she did not know who she was supposed to be. For her entire life, she had been defined by him, by his rules, his moods, his punishments. She had been the preacher's ward, the quiet girl, the sinner in need of constant correction. Without his shadow to press against, she felt formless, insubstantial. And then there was Elias. He was the hero of the story, the brave knight who had slain the dragon. The whole town knew it. She had seen the way women looked at him with admiration, the way men looked at him with respect. He was strong and whole and good, and she was the dragon's victim. She was broken, damaged goods. The preacher's final, venomous words echoed in her mind. She was never yours to save. He had meant it as a curse, a final attempt to claim ownership of her. But to Annabeth, it felt like a terrible truth. She had been saved, but she did not feel saved. She felt exposed, raw, and deeply, irrevocably flawed. How could a man like Elias ever want someone like her? Someone who had been raised in a cage, who knew nothing of the world, whose spirit had been so systematically starved? She felt the preacher's brand on her soul, the ingrained feeling of her own unworthiness. She could not imagine standing beside Elias as an equal. All she could imagine was being a burden, a constant, fragile reminder of the ugliness he had fought. She loved him with a depth that terrified her, but she did not believe, could not believe, that she would ever be enough for him. So she isolated herself. She kept to the parsonage, telling Sarah she needed time to sort through her parents' old belongings. But in truth, she was hiding from the pitying and accusing stares of the townsfolk, and hiding from Elias. She could not bear to see him, because to see him was to be confronted with the vast, impossible distance between the man he was and the broken thing she felt herself to be. On the 5th day after the preacher's arrest, Elias knew he had to leave. His wounds were beginning to heal, and his presence was a constant reminder that kept the town from beginning its own slow, painful recovery. To stay any longer would be to invite complications, to become a permanent fixture in a place he did not belong. He was a wanderer. That was his nature, and his curse. He saddled Bess in the late afternoon, the setting sun casting long shadows across the street. He tied his bedroll and his meager possessions behind the saddle. Before he left, there was one last thing he had to do. He did not go to the front door of the parsonage. He walked around to the back, to the dry creek bed where he had first taught her to hold a knife. He found her there, sitting on the same smooth stone, staring at the bleached, empty channel where a river had once flowed. She heard his footsteps and looked up. Her face was pale and thin, her eyes large and dark in the fading light. He saw the fear and the sorrow in them, and it was like a knife in his own heart. He stopped a few feet away from her, the way he had that first night. "I'm leaving, Annabeth," he said, his voice quiet. She said nothing. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She did not try to stop him, did not ask him to stay. In her silence, he heard her conviction that she was not worth staying for. He took a step closer, his resolve hardening. He would not let the preacher have this final, posthumous victory. He would not let her believe the lies that had been beaten into her for a lifetime. "Before I go," he said, his voice dropping low, "there's something you need to know, not as a question, and not as a promise you need to keep. Just as a fact, like the sun rises in the east. It's the truest thing I know." He looked directly into her eyes, holding her gaze, willing her to see the absolute sincerity in his own. "I love you. I think I have since I first saw you in the stables, trying so hard to be brave in the dark. I love your strength and your spirit, and the goodness in you that a man like Tate could never touch, no matter how hard he tried." Her breath hitched, and a sob caught in her throat. She looked down, unable to meet the intensity of his gaze. "Look at me," he said gently. He waited until her tear-filled eyes lifted to his again. "He didn't break you. You are not his. You are not defined by what he did to you. You are Annabeth Cole. You are the woman who walked into a storm to save me. You are the woman who stood up in the street and spoke the truth when no one else would. You are the strongest person I have ever known." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a page torn from a ledger book at the inn. "You have a choice now," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "For the first time in your life, you can choose what you want to do, where you want to go. You don't owe anyone anything, not this town, and not me. You deserve to choose your own life. Annabeth, without obligation to any man, that's what real freedom is." He held out the letter. Her hand trembled as she took it from him. Their fingers brushed, a spark of contact that was both a comfort and an agony. He held her gaze for one last, long moment, memorizing her face, the curve of her cheek, the depth of her dark, sorrowful eyes. Then he turned and walked away without another word. To stay any longer would be to break. Annabeth did not move. She did not call out his name. She watched his tall, solitary figure walk away, his slight limp a painful reminder of everything he had endured for her. She watched him mount his horse, a silhouette against the fiery, dying sun. She watched until he was a small, dark speck on the vast, empty plains. And then she watched until he was gone completely. A part of her wanted to scream, to run after him, to beg him to take her with him. But a deeper, quieter part of her knew he was right. She could not go to him as a refugee. If she ever went to him, it had to be as a whole person, by her own choice, on her own 2 feet. The sun sank below the horizon, plunging the world into a cool, purple twilight. She was alone again, in the silence, but this time it was different. This time, his words remained, a warm, protective ember in the cold emptiness of her heart. She looked down at the letter in her hand. She unfolded the rough paper. His handwriting was clumsy and unpracticed, the letters stark and black against the page. There were only a few lines. I will wait. I don't know where I'm going, but I will be out there, and I will wait for you. Be free, be happy. That is all I ask. Elias. Beneath his name, there was one last line, scrawled over and over again, filling the bottom of the page. It was as if his hand had a will of its own, as if the word itself was a prayer he could not stop repeating. Annabeth, 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 Annabeth. She clutched the letter to her chest, the rough paper a comforting weight against her heart. She stood there by the dry creek bed, tears streaming down her face, and watched the stars begin to appear in the vast, empty sky. He was gone, but he had left her with a map, not to him, but to herself. The seasons turned, and the land, like a body long held in the grip of a fever, began to heal. The rains came, not the violent, tearing gales of the storm that had sheltered Elias and Annabeth, but slow, soft, life-giving soaks that patiently worked their way into the parched and broken earth. For the first time in years, a faint blush of green appeared on the plains, a tender fuzz of new grass that softened the harsh, red landscape. The dry creek beds, including the one in Marrow Creek, began to whisper with a trickle of water. Then a steady murmur, the land's forgotten lifeblood beginning to flow once more. Months bled into a half-year. Elias Walker had drifted north and west, moving not with the desperate flight of a fugitive, but with the slow, meandering pace of a man searching for a place to be still. He found it, for a time, in a wide, fertile valley where a small group of settlers was trying to carve a life from the unforgiving soil. They were simple, hard-working folk, a few families from the east who had staked their dreams on the promise of the frontier. They were out of their depth, their plows breaking on the hard, rocky ground, their first well turning up dry. Elias did not offer them his name, not the one on the wanted poster. Anyway, he was just Walker, a quiet man who knew how to work. He knew the ways of the land, where to dig for water, how to read the seams in the rock. He helped them sink a new well, one that hid a deep, sweet aquifer. He worked alongside them from sunup to sundown, his hands, which had grown so accustomed to the cold weight of a revolver, now learning the heft of a pickaxe and the rhythm of a saw. He helped them lay out an irrigation line, a small, hopeful scar on the land that would carry water to their fledgling crops. He was quieter than he had been even in Marrow Creek. The men he worked with respected his silence, mistaking it for a simple, stoic nature. They saw a man who was steady and tireless, a man who asked for nothing more than a meal at the end of the day and a place to roll out his bedroll. They did not see the profound loneliness that settled over him when the work was done. When the sun went down and the vast, star-dusted sky opened up above him. In those quiet hours, he was haunted, not by the ghosts of the men he had killed, but by the ghost of a life he had walked away from. He would sit by the communal fire, the voices of the settlers and the laughter of their children a pleasant hum in the background, and he would think of Annabeth. He would pull the tattered, faded letters of her mother from his pocket. She had insisted he take them, as a reminder, and read them by the flickering light. He saw her face in the flames, heard her voice in the sighing of the wind. He had given her a choice, had set her free. It had been the hardest and the rightest thing he had ever done, but the nights were long, and the hope that she might one day find him was a fragile, flickering candle against the immense, dark expanse of the continent. He had no way of knowing what had become of her. Had she stayed in Marrow Creek? Had she found a new family, a new life? Was she happy? The question was a constant, dull ache in his chest. He had told her he would wait, but waiting was its own form of torment, a vigil with no promised end. He was more at peace than he had been in years, his days filled with the simple, honest satisfaction of constructive labor. But it was the peace of resignation, the quiet of a man who has accepted his solitude. He had saved her, but in doing so, had condemned himself to a life without her. One evening, he took his plate of beans and salted pork and walked away from the fire, seeking the solace of the darkness. He sat on a low, flat rock overlooking the valley. The new irrigation ditch a silver ribbon in the moonlight. The air was cool and clean. He ate slowly, his gaze fixed on the constellations, those distant, silent witnesses to all his wandering. He finished his meal and set the plate aside, content to simply sit and let the quiet of the night seep into him. That is when he heard it. A sound so out of place in the vast wilderness that he at first thought he had imagined it, the soft scuff of a worn leather shoe on gravel. It was not the heavy tread of one of the settlers, nor the stealthy step of a predator. It was light, hesitant, yet determined. He went still, his hand moving instinctively to his side, where his Colt revolver always rested. He was a shadow among shadows, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness. A figure emerged from the direction of the plains, a small, solitary shape moving slowly toward the faint glow of the settlers' camp. It was the figure of a woman, walking with a weary but unwavering gait. Elias's heart stopped. It was a trick of the moonlight, a phantom conjured from his own desperate longing. It had to be. He rose slowly to his feet, his breath caught in his throat. The figure came closer, and the moonlight fell upon her face. It was Annabeth. She was not the pale, frightened girl he had left behind. Her face was sunburned, her skin tanned by a relentless sun. Her hair was no longer in a severe bun, but tied back loosely, strands of it escaping to whip around her face in the night breeze. Her dress, a simple, practical calico he did not recognize, was torn at the hem and covered in the dust of a long, hard journey. She was thinner, leaner, all the softness of her confined life burned away by the trail. But her eyes were clear and deep and absolutely sure. The fear was gone. In its place was a calm, unshakable certainty that took his breath away. She stopped when she saw him, her gaze locking with his across the space of a dozen feet. She did not seem surprised to see him, as if she had known all along that he would be right here, waiting. "Elias," she said, her voice a little rough from dust and disuse, but it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He could not speak. He could only stare at her, this impossible, miraculous vision. He took a step toward her, then another, his mind struggling to accept that she was real, that she was here. He could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, but there was no weakness in her, only a strength that seemed to radiate from her very bones. "How?" he finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "How did you find me?" "I asked," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I started in Marrow Creek and went north. I asked every traveler, every farmer, every shopkeeper if they had seen a quiet man with sad eyes who was good with his hands. It took a long time, but I knew I would find you." He was standing in front of her now. So close he could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the freckles the sun had brought out across her nose. He could smell the dust and the sage and the clean, honest scent of her. The urge to pull her into his arms, to hold her and never let her go, was so powerful it was a physical agony. But he remembered his promise. He held himself in check, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. She saw the question in his eyes, the longing and the restraint. She understood the promise he was still keeping. "I'm not the same person you left, Elias," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I stayed in Marrow Creek for a while. I helped Sarah at the inn. I learned to talk to people, to look them in the eye. I sold the parsonage and all the dark things in it. I kept nothing but my mother's letters and the knife you gave me." She took a small, deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. "And I want you to know something, so that there are no more ghosts between us. I'm not a virgin anymore." The words hung in the cool night air. Elias felt them like a blow. A cold, sharp pang of jealousy and loss shot through him. He had told her to be free, to be happy, but the thought of her with another man was a torment he had not anticipated. His face must have betrayed him, because she reached out and, for the first time, touched him, her small, calloused hand resting on his forearm. "No," she said gently, seeing the pain in his eyes. "You don't understand. I haven't been with any man." Her gaze intensified, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a tone of absolute, sacred intimacy. "I gave my heart to you that night in the cave, when the storm was raging and I was so afraid, when you whispered my name like it was something holy. That was the moment I chose. That was the moment I stopped being his prisoner and started being your partner. My heart is not untouched. Elias, it has been yours all this time." Understanding dawned on him, and with it came a wave of emotion so overwhelming it buckled his knees. This was her declaration, her choice. It was not about the physical, but something infinitely deeper. She was telling him that she was whole, that she was free, and that, in her freedom, she had walked across miles of wilderness to choose him. The dam of his restraint finally broke, with a choked cry that was her name. He pulled her into his arms. She came to him not with the desperation of a frightened girl, but with the full, complete surrender of a woman who had found her home. He crushed her to him, his face buried in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, of the trail, of her incredible, unyielding spirit. She was real. She was solid. She was here. They clung to each other, trembling, not with lust, but with the raw, soul-shaking relief of two people who had been utterly alone and were now, finally, found. It was a collision of two solitudes, a joining that was more profound than any physical act. It was the relief of a long-held breath finally released, the end of a pain so constant they had forgotten what it was like to live without it. Tears streamed down his face, silent and hot, and he did not care. He held her as if she were the only anchor in a spinning universe. They did not go back to the settlers' camp that night. He led her to his small, isolated bedroll, and they sat beneath the vast, silent audience of the stars, wrapped in a single blanket, and they talked. She told him of her journey, of the people she had met, of the slow, difficult process of finding her own voice. He told her of his past, of Clara, of the wrongful killing, of the shadow he had been running from for years. He laid all his ghosts at her feet, and she was not afraid. She simply listened, her hand in his, her presence a silent absolution. In the morning, they walked to the camp together, hand in hand. Elias told the settlers he was moving on and introduced Annabeth as his wife. No one questioned it. They saw the way he looked at her, the way she stood beside him, and they understood. They bought a small piece of land not far from that valley, a plot that had been scorched by a brush fire years before, but was now showing the first faint signs of new life. It had a creek that ran through it, and a stand of cottonwoods for shade. Together, they built a small, sturdy ranch house, their hands working side by side. They built it on land that was scarred and wounded, but softened by the promise of returning rain and the hope of a future. He was still a man wanted by the law, and she was still a woman healing from a lifetime of wounds. But they were no longer defined by their pasts. They were free. Free from the prisons of others' making and the ones they had built for themselves. They had found their justice not in a badge or a verdict, but in the quiet, daily act of choosing each other. They had found their faith not in a church, but in the unwavering resilience of the human heart. And under the wide, forgiving sky of the West, on a piece of land that was their own, they finally, truly, began to believe in love. Thank you for listening. Comment where you're from to connect with others. And don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.